Warning: this content contains terrifying surprises. We strongly advise against watching alone. Viewer discretion is recommended. The evening had begun to descend as Dira sped her motorcycle down the narrow path leading to the secluded village. Tall, dense trees stood proudly on both sides of the road, their shadows dancing on the gravel-covered ground. The sound of crickets and the whisper of the evening breeze formed a somber symphony, as if welcoming Dira to a place she knew would change her life forever.
Is it true that the house is still there? The old house Grandma used to tell stories about before bed.
Dira held her breath as her thoughts drifted to her grandmother's tales of an old house on the edge of the village, hidden deep within the forest. A house said to harbor shadows of the past that had never left. Dira's eyes stayed fixed ahead, hoping to spot signs of the house at the end of the road. The road twisted sharply, forcing her to slow down. The night air grew colder, seeping through her leather jacket. In the distance, a vague shadow loomed, standing tall as if defying time itself. Dira knew this was the old house her grandmother had spoken of, now only a few hundred meters away.
I've waited long enough. It's time to uncover the truth behind those shadows.
Dira's footsteps crunched on the gravel as she stepped onto the yard of the old house. Dry leaves scattered under her feet created a haunting rustle. The house stood towering, its walls faded and wooden windows half open, as if calling out with a soft whisper. In front of the door, a large mirror stood covered in dust and cobwebs, reflecting the darkening sky's shadows. With trembling hands, Dira lifted the tattered cloth covering the mirror. But as the cloth fell away and the mirror was revealed, she did not see her own reflection. Instead, there was another figure in the mirror, staring at her with empty eyes, as if waiting to tell the story that had long been hidden. The old house stands proudly in the middle of the forest, surrounded by lush trees that seem to be eternal guardians. No one knows exactly how long the house has stood there. The building was sturdy, even though moss was growing on every wall, and the wooden windows creaked when blown by the night wind. Many say the house is haunted, a gathering place for curious spirits trapped between this world and another. One day, a girl named Dira came to the house. He heard rumors about an old mirror that was kept inside, a large mirror that was said to be able to show a person's past, present, and future. Dira has always been interested in mystical things, and her curiosity brought her here. With careful steps, he opened the creaking front door. The hoarse sound of its hinge echoed, making the hairs on the back of his neck bristle. In the main room of the house, a large mirror stood, its frame made of intricately carved wood. The mirror looked ancient, but its surface was still clean, as if it had always been polished.
No, what is...
However, when he looked deeper, his image in the mirror changed. Her face faded, replaced by an old woman with eyes full of sadness.
Where is this? What happened?
Instantly, he was in a strange place. Long hallways with doors lined up on both sides. Each door looked identical, but Ronnie knew there was something different behind each one.
Where is this? What happened? This is Grandma's garden?
Behind the first door, Ronnie saw herself, still small, sitting in the garden playing with dolls. He recognized the place, the garden at his grandmother's house, where he often used to play. But those memories were different from what he remembered. There was a woman with an unfamiliar face, standing in the distance watching little Ronnie with a sharp gaze. Dira stood frozen in front of the first door, her gaze still directed at the mysterious woman in her childhood garden. heart was beating fast. Fear spread throughout his body. Without thinking, he pulled back the door, closing it quickly. The sound of the door closing loudly echoed in the dark hallway. Dira took a deep breath, trying to control the fear that flooded her. He looked at the row of doors around him. Nervously, he stepped towards the second door, hoping to find answers to all these oddities. Dira closed the door quickly, turning to the next door. Dira stood in front of the second door, her hands shaking as she reached for the doorknob. He opened the door slowly, ready to face whatever was behind it. Dira is now in a quiet cemetery. Dira looking around, realizing that she is in the future. Ahead of him, he saw himself, several years older, standing in front of an unmarked grave. Behind it, he sees his future self, standing in a cemetery. He cried in front of an unnamed grave, the figure of a man standing next to the future. The man looked pale, with empty eyes, as if he had lost hope. His gaze was fixed on himself in the future, but no emotion appeared on his face. Dira, who was in the present, looked at the man in surprise, feeling that there was something familiar but terrifying. And beside him, there was a man staring at him blankly. Dira took a step back, feeling her chest tight with discomfort. The atmosphere at the funeral felt increasingly tense. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it faint whispers that could not be understood. Dira looked back, her gaze filled with fear. Hastily, he closed the second door, his heart beating faster. She tried to control the fear that was welling up, but the image of the funeral and the man's empty gaze were still in her mind. In a hurry, his breath came in short gasps. He leaned against the cold hallway wall, trying to calm his beating heart, which felt as if it was going to explode. The coldness from the walls crept into his body, but it was unable to reduce the fear and sadness that enveloped his heart. Dira filled with fear and confusion. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, but the image of the grave and the empty-faced man was still clearly etched in his mind. As tears began to well up in the corners of his eyes, her heart was pounding, feeling suffocated by the sudden sadness that hit her. Who is buried there? Who is that man? Dira opened her eyes slowly, looking at the door in front of her. His mind was filled with questions he couldn't answer. A deep sense of sadness swept over him, like a thick fog covering his heart. Dira looked down the long hallway. The endless rows of doors seemed to mock her helplessness. Dira pressed her chest with one hand, trying to reduce the tightness. He felt as if he was trapped between reality and a nightmare, without knowing how to get out. His gaze turned to the second door he had just closed, as if looking for an answer behind the wood of the door.
What does all this mean? Who will be buried there? And that guy, why is he looking at me like that?
Dira, catching the vulnerability in his eyes. The faint sound of laughter from a small child was heard again, echoing in the hallway, making her flinch and turn her head towards the sound. However, there was no one there. The hallway remained empty, except for a row of doors that stretched as far as the eye could see. He wiped away the tears that were starting to roll down his cheeks. He gathered courage, strengthened his heart. Dira took a deep breath, then stepped towards the next door. Even though his heart was still filled with sadness and fear, his strong sense of curiosity pushed him to continue moving forward. He knew that the only way to find answers was to face those fears, one door at a time. Dira stopped in front of the third door. Her hand, which was still slightly shaking, reached for the door handle. He closed his eyes for a moment, reminding himself to stay strong. Slowly, he opened the door, ready to face whatever was waiting for him on the other side. He walked slowly towards the last door. His every step echoed through the silent hallway. He was still breathing hard. His heart was beating fast. Fear mixed with curiosity continued to push him forward, even though every step felt difficult. When he reached the last door, he stopped for a moment, took a deep breath. He knew this was his last chance to find answers, or at least to understand what really happened. Dira's hand reached out. Her trembling fingers touched the cold doorknob. Dira slowly turned the door handle. The door hinges creaked loudly, creating a resounding hoarse sound that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Hesitantly, he pushed the door open, standing in the doorway, staring into a room that seemed like a boundless void. Thick darkness enveloped the entire room, erasing the line between the ceiling and the floor. There was no light source, no sound, just deafening silence. Dira stepped forward, one leg raised hesitantly, into the darkness. As soon as his feet touched the floor of the dark room, the darkness seemed to suck all the available light. The camera shows him looking back, seeing the door slowly close by itself, disappearing into the darkness. Fear enveloped him.
Hello? Who's here?
No answer. Only the silence deepened, as if it had solidified around him. He groped in the air, looking for something to hold on to, but all he found was darkness. Dira stood alone, looking small in the middle of the endless darkness. The sound of his breathing became increasingly heavier, accompanied by the sound of his heart beating increasingly louder. Suddenly, there was the sound of footsteps, slowly approaching from a distance. The sound of footsteps echoed in the dark room, making him look in all directions in panic. But nothing could be seen. Dira knew, in the darkness, there was something waiting for him. Dira was standing in the middle of a dark room, with no end in sight. Darkness enveloped the entire space, as if absorbing all light. The camera shows the scared expression on Dira's face as she tries to look for something in the total darkness. There was nothing there, only whispered voices coming from all directions, chanting his name over and over again. Suddenly, whispering sounds began to be heard from all around. The voice was gentle, yet terrifying, as if flowing from the walls of darkness. The whispered voice uttered Dira's name in a tone that was calming, but also intimidating. Dira, Drira. Whispering sounds rang out over and over again, making him feel as if he was surrounded by something he couldn't see. The whisper sounded familiar, but also strange and confusing, as if there was something he knew but couldn't identify.
Who is there? What do you want?
The whispering continued, getting closer and more intense. He felt the pressure of darkness getting stronger, as if the room was moving, sucking him in. Dira's face becoming increasingly panicked, her breathing increasingly rapid. Dira slowly disappeared into the darkness that was closing in more and more tightly around her. The whispering sound became increasingly distant and faint, eventually disappearing altogether. As he retreated further, his legs and body felt increasingly sucked into darkness. Darkness seemed to stretch out its hand, pulling him deeper. The camera follows Dira's movements as she gets sucked in. The look of fear on her face deepens. Dira slowly disappeared into the darkness that was closing in more and more tightly around her. The whispering sound became increasingly distant and faint, eventually disappearing altogether. He stepped back, but the darkness sucked him in, leaving only an eerie silence. Dira woke up gasping, falling on the floor of the main room of the old house. Sweat dripped down his forehead, and his breathing sounded heavy and irregular. Dira lying on the floor, her eyes closed for a moment before slowly opening them. The room was dimly lit with moonlight coming in through the broken window. When she finally opened her eyes, she raised her head and looked around in confusion. The room looked the same as before, but there was a strange and eerie feeling that filled the air. He turned to the large mirror that stood in the corner of the room. The frame looked dark and worn. With great difficulty, he stood up and grabbed the wall to balance himself. He slowly approached the mirror, shaking hands touching the cold wooden frame. The camera follows her movements, showing a mixed expression of fear and astonishment on her face. When he stood in front of the mirror, he looked at his reflection. At first, the image in the mirror seemed faint and blurry, but then it became clearer. He looked at himself. This time, it was really him, looking fresher than before. He was breathing heavily, sweat dripping down his forehead. He looked in the mirror and saw his own reflection. This time, it was really him. He looked into the mirror intently, confirming that his reflection was indeed himself. His image looked calm, as if comforting him amidst the chaos he had just experienced. Dira touched the mirror surface gently, trying to feel the reality behind the reflection. He pondered for a moment, assessing whether everything that happened was a nightmare or something more than that. The camera focuses on the doubtful and questioning expression on her face.
What happened? Is this real?
The sound from outside the mirror, a faint whisper came again, disturbing the silence. Dira turned quickly. Her eyes scanned around the room, but nothing seemed different from before. Darkness and silence still enveloped the old house. Slowly, he looked back at the mirror, hoping to find answers from his reflection. The camera shows his reflection remaining calm, as if there is a hidden message behind the reflection. What is really hidden behind the mirror? Has he returned to reality? Or is he still trapped in an endless nightmare? Dira stood in front of the mirror. Her breathing had begun to stabilize after waking up from the darkness. He looked intently at his own reflection in the mirror, trying to understand what was really happening. The atmosphere of the room was still filled with darkness and silence, with moonlight gently seeping through the broken window. As he continued to stare in the mirror, suddenly, he felt something strange. In the corner of the mirror, far from his own reflection, he began to see another figure. The image of an old woman appeared slowly, standing in a dark corner of the mirror. However, in the corner of the mirror, the image of an old woman with eyes full of sadness seemed to be standing, looking at him. Old woman appeared in ancient clothes. Her face was full of wrinkles, and her eyes were filled with deep sadness. His figure was vague, almost like a silhouette in the darkness, but his eyes were very clear, looking at her with strong emotional intensity. Dira watched the old woman with a surprised and confused expression. He tried to move, but his legs felt heavy. The old woman slowly lifted the corners of her lips, forming a gentle but pained smile. That smile seemed to contain a deep message.
Who are you?
As she spoke, the old woman began to fade from the mirror, her smile still remaining on her face until her figure had almost completely disappeared. The camera shows the change in her expression, from surprise to sadness and in confusion. After the figure of the old woman disappeared, the mirror returned to showing her reflection, who was alone. Dira looked at the mirror full of curiosity and fear, trying to understand the meaning of the appearance. Dira took a deep breath, her eyes still looking at the mirror full of questions, his face looking confused and contemplative, as if he is searching for the meaning of this mysterious encounter.
What are you trying to tell me?
Dira was still standing in front of the mirror with a mixed expression. The atmosphere in the room remained calm, with only the sound of gentle wind coming from outside. The darkness in the corners of the room seemed to add a sense of mystery. Dira came out of the old house with mixed feelings. The morning sky was starting to dawn, dispelling the darkness of night, but the atmosphere remained cold and damp. Dira stepped away from the old house, looking depressed and exhausted. The camera follows his heavy, slow steps. Dira left the house with mixed feelings. He never revealed the secret of the old mirror to anyone. Dira walked away from the old house which now looked even more frightening in the morning light. The building seemed to remind him of what had happened inside. Dira arrived at her own house, and she entered her room exhausted. She steps into the room which now seems more comfortable and familiar compared to the darkness of the old house. Dira stood in front of the large mirror in her room, took a deep breath before looking at her reflection. The mirror looked normal, but you could tell there was something different. The camera shows Dira's face full of anxiety as she looks in the mirror. But every time he looked at the mirror in his room, he saw the image of the old woman smiling at him. In the mirror, he saw the image of the old woman clearly. The old woman smiled gently at him, her face full of sadness, but also giving off a sense of peace. That smile seemed to want to convey something that couldn't be expressed in words. Dira looked at the image of the old woman with mixed feelings. That smile felt comforting, but also scary. He felt like something was unfinished, and the old woman wanted him to know or do something.
What do you want from me?
The image of the old woman continued to smile, not giving an answer, but her presence was felt so strongly and deeply. Dira sighed, her eyes filled with tears. He knew he couldn't just forget the experience. Dira looked at the mirror with an expression full of confusion and deep reflection. Even though he left the old house, the mirror and the old woman's reflection remained a part of his life. Even though the old house had been abandoned, the secret of the old mirror remained alive in his memory, and the image of the old woman continued to come to him every time he looked in the mirror.